If you're new to sewing, you're going to run into the term seam allowance. So what is it and why does it matter? I'm going to answer those questions and give you even more information in this video. Seam allowance is the distance away from the edge of the fabric piece to the place where you're going to sew. Many commercial patterns use 5/8 inch for your seam allowance, which is roughly 1.5 centimeters. I honestly don't know the history of this. Regardless of why commercial patterns use 5/8 inch, it's always a good idea to check your pattern and the instructions to make sure that it is 5/8 inch, so that you know what you should be sewing at. Older patterns, decades older, didn't even include seam allowance on the pattern pieces, so you had to add them yourself. Newer patterns for stretch knit garments often use a smaller seam allowance, like 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters. And I've even seen a glove pattern with a 1/8 inch seam allowance called out on the fingers. So why the difference? There's a few reasons why you might want a different seam allowance on different pattern pieces of your garment or different garments. The first one is, what are you going to do with the seam? If you're simply going to press open your seams and maybe finish them with a zigzag or overlock, 5/8 inch, 1/2 inch, those larger seam allowances are perfectly fine. If you're going to open up the garment piece and fold it back in on itself, thereby having 4 layers of fabric, the 2 outside fabric pieces and the 2 inside seam allowances, most likely you would want to have a much shorter seam allowance, such as 1/4 of an inch. In fact, most commercial patterns that have a 5/8 inch seam allowance in these areas tend to have the next step after you sew it to trim your seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. So why not start with that to begin with? Yeah, there's no reason not to. If you buy a pattern from Islander Sewing Systems, those patterns are already drafted with an already trimmed seam allowance. There's absolutely no point in doing that extra step. The second reason to have a very specific seam allowance is, how are you going to finish your seam? For example, in knitwear, it's often assumed you're going to sew it on a serger, in which case you'll be overlocking the edges of the seam together. A serger has a knife blade that will trim down that seam allowance to the 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Whereas on your sewing machine, you don't have that luxury. So if you're doing this on a sewing machine, you might as well start with the 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch seam to begin with. And of course, if you're just going to cut it off on your serger, why have it that big to begin with? If you're going to do a faux flat felled seam, which might be on the outside pair of a jeans type pattern, you'll basically need to keep those 2 seam allowances together, and you'll fold them to one side and you're going to top stitch back down. In this case, you need to have that seam allowance long enough or wide enough to be caught in the second row of stitching. So if you are doing a 3/8 inch wide stitching, you'll probably want a 1/2 inch or maybe even a little wider seam allowance. And if you're going to do some sort of fancy folded in on itself edge finishing on the inside of your garment, you'll want a wider seam allowance in order to have more ability to manipulate those seam allowances and sew them. Personally, I love conserving fabric and saving steps, so I usually tend to use much smaller seam allowances. I often draft my patterns with either a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that makes me think, why would I ever want a bigger seam allowance? So if you're sewing a garment for the very first time, and this is usually a test garment for test fit, you may want to go with a little larger seam allowance, such as 3/4 to 1 inch for fit insurance. And that way, when you do try on the test garment, you can actually take in or out those seams if you need to. But I wouldn't go above 1 inch. Also, if you're making a muslin or some sort of test fit garment, you may want to go with a 1 inch wide seam allowance on the seam where you need to pin it together to pin it on your body. This will give you a lot more space to work with when you're trying to close the garment for pinning. This is especially important when you're doing something really fitted or really tight, such as a moulage or maybe a bustier. The last thing I would consider is practicality. You definitely don't want to go too small because it'll pull apart or have greater risk of pulling apart if it's stressed. And it's definitely harder to sew. So even that 1/8 inch seam allowance that's called for on that pattern for gloves, I don't really know where that is on my machine, so I'm going to have to figure out where 1/8 inch is on my machine and try to sew that tiny little seam allowance. But to be fair, I don't have a 1/4 inch seam mark either, so I just know where it lies on the foot I usually use. What I wouldn't consider in terms of marking seam allowances is your comfort level of sewing. More seam allowance isn't going to make your sewing any more accurate. It just gives you more wiggle room to fail on the making the garment larger side. You could still screw up and make it smaller on the smaller side and maybe even run into an issue. It's better to just get more comfortable sewing a variety of seam allowances. And you do this with practice.